Hello, True Health Seeker, and welcome to another exciting episode of the Learn True Health podcast. I have been on such a high since I finished this interview with this amazing PhD in neuroscience. It's phenomenal. It's so fascinating. In fact, Dr. Andrew Hill has been helping people to reverse ADHD, reverse the symptoms of autism. Children are even going from nonverbal to be able to be verbal, for example, reversing the damage done by head injuries, helping people to gain top performance, brain performance. So imagine if you used to be able to really be good at math and now you're finding that your brain slowed down. Maybe you're have lots of brain fog and you can't really concentrate. It is so exciting that what he does is teaches the brain how to function optimally. So you'll get better sleep. That's actually one of the things you can work on with this type of neuroscience is better sleep, better mental clarity, better functioning brain. So many exciting things. And what I love that he talks about how diet plays a role, how nutrition plays a role. One thing I'd love for you to do if you're interested in increasing your diet to a place where there's more nutrition and it is appropriate, all the foods are appropriate for healing your body and getting the right supplements to help you. Remember, supplements are to supplement, right? So you want a good diet is the foundation for your health. If you are struggling with any kind of health problems, you need the foundation of a wonderful diet. And then to fill in the gaps where there are missing areas of key nutrients is fill it in with wonderful, high quality organic supplements. I really recommend you go to takeyoursupplements.com, and that's because the people there are amazing health coaches that work for free will work with you. You put in your name and email address and your phone number. They'll give you a call and an email within 24 hours, and they're fantastic. I personally know all of them. I love them. They're amazing people. They're so highly trained and they have such huge hearts. They love helping people month after month. So, you can buy your supplements online or you could go to a supplement store. But what you won't get there by going to a supplement store or buying it online is you won't get a coach that's going to hold your hand and month after month help you tweak your diet, tweak your lifestyle, tweak your supplements. That makes it so that you get the results you're looking for. Now, what I love that Dr. Andrew Hill does is he takes all this amazing science to optimize the performance of the brain. And it's amazing that he sees that nutrition plays such a key role in our mental health. And of course, if we have good mental health, we have good emotional health. It all trickles down. But we need to start by nourishing every cell in the body. Thank you so much for listening to my show. And please, if this makes a difference for you, please share it. Let's get this information out to as many people as possible and help as many people as we can. Enjoy today's interview. Remember, go to takeyoursupplements.com. Welcome to the Learn True Health podcast. I'm your host, Ashley James. This is episode 173. I am thrilled to have with us Dr. Andrew Hill, who's here to teach us all about how to master our mind, how to take control of this wonderful thing we have between our ears, and gain. It's almost like, from what I understand, Andrew, it's like you're here to give us the manual that was supposed to come with our body and our mind when we were born. And we kind of been running around with our mind running us instead of us running our mind. And now you're here to teach us how to gain control of this wonderful machine in between our ears. Is that correct?
Well, there's certainly things that can be done. I mean, unfortunately, even neuroscientists don't have a really good understanding of most of the brain. That's one of the dirty little secrets of neuroscience. We end up sort of seeing the brain, and to some extent, as a phenomena we manage or interpret, and less about real deep understanding of a lot of it, unfortunately. And that's definitely true for the kind of stuff that I tend to do, which is around things like EEG, which is brain waves, as well as more basic and older forms of neuroscience, if you will, like meditation. And we know some things about these processes and what they do to the brain and how to use them and how to take control and how to optimize your experience, reduce your suffering, improve your performance, get rid of problems in your brain and your mind, your psychology, your physiology, with all kinds of techniques. But unfortunately, it's still kind of like somebody took a bunch of different manuals that weren't all that accurate and stapled them together, and this is what we understand about the brain. So I will, at the very least, try to give you a few signposts about what is likely important to think about, and a few ways that we might want to consider taking specific control and evaluating that process and getting your hands and your head, no pun intended, around that process.
Very cool. Well, I'm excited to have you here today. I know my listeners definitely want to learn more about how we can master our own minds. The idea of holistic medicine, which is what our podcast is about, is understanding how to have health emotionally, mentally, spiritually, physically, energetically, every aspect of our being, not just physical. And when it comes to mental and emotional health, a lot of that has to do with tapping into how our brain works and how we can best work with this machine instead of let this machine run us. Like we can let anxiety run us or fear run us, or we can learn how to master our own mechanisms. Before we get into learning more about how we can take control and understand how to use neuroscience and meditation, neurofeedback, and all the wonderful things that you teach to get the results we want in life, I'd love to learn more about you. What had you become this incredible expert that you are today?
Well, I'm not sure I'm an incredible expert. There's certainly a lot of things I know a lot about, in psychology, neuroscience. Gerontology is one of my areas as well. I teach gerontology at UCLA. I've been involved in clinical work for many, many years, for like more than 20 years in various aspects. Even though I'm not a clinician, I'm not a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist or anything. And when I was in college, initially, I got a job working for what ended up being many years in a residential facility that worked with developmentally disabled adults primarily. And at the time, 25 years ago or something, at the time in Massachusetts, the institutionalization of retarded adults, disabled adults, was ending. California and Massachusetts tend to lead the way in progressive healthcare reform in the U.S., and Massachusetts was doing this about 20, 25, 30 years ago throughout this process. And so as the state school system, as it was called, the state schools, were all closed, there was this massive flood of multiply disabled individuals from young adult through quite old adult status moving into residential facilities and then eventually into shared living situations when appropriate. Mainstreaming was becoming a thing, and moving people through different types of services was happening. The system was evolving. And I got involved with it around that time when the residential piece of it was really coming online, and ended up working in a couple different residential facilities, sort of group homes essentially, and ended up managing one for several years. And my experience was, working with these really people with fairly severe needs, multiply disabled, typically blind or deaf or both, typically developmentally disabled or mentally retarded. Many of them had other things as well, including physical things like CP or seizures or other disabilities. And so they were fairly people with fairly extreme needs, and also pretty dramatic, consistent across the population I worked with. I think because the facility, the company I worked for, tended to go after these types of clients when they were bidding for the state school system, is they were all nonverbal. And so the verbal challenges in these individuals was so profound that you had to learn to communicate with people in a very different way. And I ended up learning a bunch of tactile sign and beyond that, simply learning what kind of I hesitate to say innate, but core, human things that people tend to do and tend to want to do, and those include things like laughter and pleasure and eating and all kinds of interesting other things that people seem to have, even when their cognition and their communication is not necessarily typical or intact. And so I had this experience of working with really people out on the fringes, if you will, of typical brains. And there was some autism in there, of course, although at that time it wasn't quite as well understood. It's not that autism is now, but certainly not 25 years ago. And over the next few years in that role, I found it both interesting and a little frustrating and heartbreaking. And I spent, the wins you would have in those environments were very small. So I spent a year teaching somebody to use a fork once, and that was our big, event. Our big win was that he was using a fork at the end of the year instead of in just his hands. But he didn't really enjoy using a fork, you know, and it was sort of taught through, rote to some extent and reward. But over time, he, had a little more, from our perspective as a typical society, he had a little more dignity when he was eating, maybe, and could therefore, go out a little more often or something. Um, but he didn't care. And so that was my big win, in that environment. And at some point, I don't remember exactly when, but I wanted to work with different populations. And they ended up working in inpatient psych work for about 5 or 6 years. And I worked with latency age children, inpatient psych, critical adult psych, geriatric psych, dual diagnosis addiction, and psychiatric units. And again, just found myself working in a facility, a hospital in this case, in Western Massachusetts, that was among the most acute in the country, as far as I could tell. Having just dozens of emergency hands-on restraint codes all the time, around the clock. And that was an environment I found myself in, and I both found it, much better in some ways because now people were moving through different challenges sometimes, especially kids. I find if you take kids out of you take kids who are emotionally or psychologically, wounded or hurting or acting out of an environment where they're, where it's being reinforced, a lot of the time the kids will stabilize after a few days, and then you can sort of do this thing where you engage the environment they're returning to in a healthy way and provide a lot of change over time, which felt really good. But it was still a lot of hard work, a lot of heartbreaking work. And then the acute psychiatric population there was revolving door, which most psychiatric facilities were then, I think still are now, to a large extent, of people coming and going. One of the reasons that it's so difficult to treat some of the most acute things like some forms of schizophrenia and psychosis, and certainly depression, major depression, which is a big problem and one of the most major psychiatric issues across all ages, but certainly in elders and things. Depression is very difficult, and it takes sometimes weeks for imperfect pharmaceutical interventions to start working, and you may not have weeks in the contracted healthcare environment that showed up 20, 30 years ago. 40 years ago, if you had a psychiatric problem that included major depression, you might spend a few weeks in a hospital or a couple of months, depending what you needed. But when I was working in this acute psychiatric facility, I worked there for, I think, for 4.5 years. At the beginning of the time I was there, the average length of stay was 11 days in the state for general funded care at this level. And by the time I left that hospital, actually it ended up closing, the average length of stay had dropped to 3 days inpatient in terms of funding. So there was this pretty dramatic shift in how healthcare was being abandoned, if you will, at the acute hospital level. And we still haven't figured that out, I don't think, in this country. But regardless, I was seeing more change, and I was also seeing more acuity and getting a lot more experience with more varied brains across different ages. And I started to get some sense of what was working and wasn't working. And mostly what I saw was things not working, and us, maintaining, managing, being palliative in our symptom management, not giving people a lot of effective tools. And it was very frustrating. And so I was thinking about what to do, go back to med school, grad school, what should I do? And I had done a lot of work in that hospital working with a latency age population. I became a case manager for latency age 4 to 10-year-olds, and had a lot of kid experience, some adolescent experience. And so I had heard about and was interested in this thing called neurofeedback, which is a form of biofeedback on the brain. And it was invented about 50 years ago. And I probably heard about it, 25 years ago or something, and had been interested, but hadn't really had access to it. And so before I went and committed to something like, med school or nursing school or something, I decided to see if I could find a way to get some experience in that, and went to work for a place in Providence, Rhode Island, called the Neurodevelopment Center, which is a neurofeedback center that has a specialty in autistic spectrum disorders. And that's worth emphasizing because not much changes brains over time, regardless of brain. But certainly, if you're an autistic spectrum brain that's over aroused and sort of hot and having a hard time integrating and calming down, it's very difficult to make inroads in learning and other aspects of being human with these dramatically often over aroused or under resourced brains. And I had such a deep experience working in psychiatric and acute care that I'd seen all kinds of things over the previous years. And I started working for this guy, Dr. Larry Hirschberg in Providence, and started seeing autistic spectrum and ADHD people coming in and getting change. I kept seeing ADHD dropping away reliably. I kept seeing autism symptoms being reduced. Self-stimming, obsessions, anxiety, that over-arousal thing, the sensory integration stuff, sometimes eye contact, sense of humor, sometimes language. I started seeing change. I mean, change on in a time scale that baffled me compared to what I thought I knew. I thought I was, at that point, this was about 15 years ago, I don't know, a decade of experience in health and human services in the trenches across inpatient, outpatient, residential, psychiatric, long-term. I mean, educational, case management. Every level of health and human services. I was the guy for the previous decade. I thought I was very experienced, and I saw suddenly changes that were happening on a time course that didn't fit what I had been doing before. Didn't make sense in terms of how we were managing cases, especially in latency age adolescent, which is what I was seeing at the Neurodevelopment Center in Providence. I was seeing a lot of like 5 to maybe 15-year-olds, and I was just seeing change most of the time. And in psychiatric care, even in non-acute mental health care, the efficacy is pretty low with traditional tools like therapy and meds. I mean, the efficacy is, if you had 50%, that's good on a med, and most forms of talk therapy are probably right around that. And so that we have imperfect tools and imperfect understanding of how to use them, and they kind of work, acute or non-acute, and they're slow and they're gradual, and there's often some hitting and missing, hunting and pecking about to evaluate what's going to work. And here I was seeing people with profound ADHD, kids or adults with profound ADHD, getting massively in the way of their life, having symptoms go away completely in a matter of a few months, and go away for good in many cases. And I was seeing self-stimming autistic kids calm down, and every so often a profoundly autistic kid would have better eye contact or have some language improvements. And these were things that just did not make sense to me in terms of what I had thought we were all about in managing brains and managing. I had longed for change. I mean, when I was working especially in residential for those years, which was about 8 years total, I would have dreams several years into that process of my nonverbal clients would be speaking. I sort of longed for these people to make change, and they still showed the ability to learn, and they could learn, and they could change, and they were intact people, even if they were not intact cognitively or developmentally. But they were still people. There was still something there. This neurofeedback stuff, blew my mind because it seemed to be the thing that I wished had been there for every one of these people whose brains weren't what they needed to be. That was the impetus. I mean, since then, my perspective has shifted, and I now think that if you have a brain, you should be taking care of it in some way, or at least taking control of it. You should, mental fitness, physical fitness, brain fitness, it's all sort of the same thing to some extent. And I think you're neglecting if you aren't doing brain. But that's for later on in our conversation. So that's the motivation anyways.
Wow. I can't imagine. Your jaw must have just been on the floor as you'd spent so many years really not getting the results you craved, and then all of a sudden seeing this work so much better, seeing neurofeedback, biofeedback work so much better than you ever imagined. Was there like, can you bring us back to that moment that you first had this, oh my gosh, I can't believe it? Like, was there a specific moment?
There's a few, yeah. I mean, I saw a lot of things working for Dr. Hirschberg at the Neurodevelopment Center. I remember one time, and this rarely happens, just to set expectations. This is not what happens every time in neurofeedback, but every so often something like this happens. It's like 3 or 4 sessions in, and some 6-year-old girl who doesn't make eye contact and is mostly nonverbal and doesn't hasn't talked too much and doesn't communicate. a few sessions in, she was going down the hall to the neurofeedback center, and she put her hand up at a painting on the wall and went, ballerina. And it was a painting of a ballerina, an abstract Monet or something. And we were like, wow, that was kind of cool. She doesn't usually talk. And then she sat down for the session. Her mom was there in the room. And about 5 minutes into the session, she turned and grabbed her mom's hand, made eye contact, and said, Mommy, I love you. And we were all like, waterworks. And everyone was, like, oh my God. And so every so often, there's this breakthrough event in neurofeedback. And over time, I sort of view the huge efficacy and what it can do as a little bit, like, oh yeah, of course we do that with neurofeedback. But that was my first event where I was like, oh my God, this thing happened that was dramatic. I saw it happen instantly. Another almost contrary example, somebody came in who had been self-training their kid at one point in practice, and self-training a lot, and not really knowing what they were doing, just repeating the same protocol again and again. And a pretty high-functioning kid regressed to really profound, sort of self-stimming autism. He went from verbal to nonverbal. He ended up moving back with supervised training back to where he needed to be, and actually became, sort of almost non-diagnosable. And I've seen that happen a few times, where kids that no one understood, that were getting weird diagnoses like ADHD, OCD, and autism or something. These really complicated, just suffering brains. I see those, and sometimes we touch those, and very, very quickly everything gets better. But no, I mean, it's not so much any specific event. Ultimately, it's the fact that I was seeing 70 or 80% of people coming through, with needs, psychiatric mental health, if you will, developmental brain needs, show changes. I was seeing everyone change. Not occasional people change. Occasionally we see breakthroughs, like these incredibly heart-touching, string pulling, tear-jerking moments. But we almost always see something. And so a few sessions in, people start to feel a little different, and the fidgety kid that has self-esteem issues starts to be, a little more tractable, and then they feel very confident because suddenly they can be in control of how fidgety or how talkative or how interrupty they are. Or we get somebody who's been really shy, a lot of social anxiety, be able to kind of let that go on whenever they want. Or somebody who's autistic or Asperger's who gets really stressed out when the bus doesn't show up, work through that because you're able to train up the frontal blood flow and make their brain more flexible. And so they can handle, that sort of anxiety, stress where resources drop. That's a big problem often in high functioning autism or Asperger's, where you get stressed out and you freeze because you don't know what, your expectations are violated, you know what to do next. And you can train that up. You train that resource limit, that bottleneck out to some extent with infrared blood flow training called HEG. But it's not so much what I saw; it's what I was seeing everywhere. And so after a couple of years of this, I ended up getting a job doing some neuroimaging at McLean Hospital, working for Dr. Mike Henry, and trying to figure out the tissue side, because EEG, which is what neurofeedback largely is electricity. And I was curious about, the deeper neuroscience. I had an undergraduate degree that had a neuroscience focus, but I was still pretty new. And this was 20 years ago or 15 years ago when I was educated. Well, at this point, 25 years ago. So the neuroscience was moving, and took some classes, decided that I really needed to learn more neuroscience. And I went back and got a PhD at UCLA. And so in 2005, I moved to California, and I've been there ever since. And I got my PhD in cognitive neuroscience from UCLA, and mostly studying neurofeedback because I didn't understand what was happening. I mean, to make it worse, EEG is a messy, noisy environment. To make it even worse, at the time, those couple of years that I was working in neurofeedback initially for Dr. Hirschberg, computers were expensive. EEG was just barely coming into price range for individual practitioners. Technology was not where it is now by any means, 20, 30 years ago. So we were still operating in the dark ages. We kind of are still in the brain, but back then it was a little bit worse. And I just happened to get really lucky about working with Dr. Hirschberg and seeing a lot of change. And he, as I discovered, was pretty agnostic, in terms of, at the time there were 2 or 3 or 4 sort of schools of thought about how neurofeedback must be working. What is it, And that would influence the approaches people took. And that's still true to some extent today. But back then there was, vociferous sort of the schools or churches of neurofeedback, and there's probably three big ones that really had staunch proponents, lobbing verbal assaults at each other on news groups all day long, and everyone arguing about everything. Intellectuals, do that, but this was some pretty deep stuff at times, and I got lucky with Dr. Hirschberg that he didn't subscribe to any specific school of thought. He got all the tools, he got all the training, he tried everything. He's in the neuroscience, and so I got a lot of that perspective from him. But the weird thing, even though there was these different opposing schools of thought that people were arguing about, no matter which school of thought you're in, people were getting good results, and the underlying ideas about these schools of thought were in conflict, which means we didn't know what we were doing. Essentially, we had what I call a blind men and elephant situation. We've all got a piece of it. We're interpreting it wrong. The piece we got is probably right, but the interpretation, how we're using it, the models, imperfect, inaccurate, maybe misleading. I still think that's true. I think in neurofeedback, as well as many more nuanced, if you will, practices of health, medicine, fitness, when you're interacting with systems and subtle, self-regulating systems, I think that you have to be careful to know what your models of the system are and how you're operating, but don't believe your models too carefully or too closely. Don't believe them to be blind to the blindness of what is actually happening. You must always suspect that you're missing most of what's going on, so you can be informed by the fluctuating things that don't make sense based on how you understand the brain. And I found myself in this position working with Dr. Hirschberg of not having to buy into any one way of doing things, and to a large extent learning everything and discovering through that what I thought was the best way, if you will, to do neurofeedback. And then I decided to go back to grad school to figure out what the heck was going on in neurofeedback, because we did not understand it. And I did some grad work around it. I helped one of the lead developers for the biggest software test out a double-blind module, so you can do placebo-controlled double-blind neurofeedback now with Eager as a software, EEGER. But Howard Lightstone, who's the lead developer for Eager, developed this really sophisticated module for doing double-blind research, and we used it in my grad work, my dissertation work, and most of my work was on evoked potentials in EEG, assessing attention in the brain, quantitative EEG, and neurofeedback, so the whole EEG space to some extent. But some listeners may enjoy hearing about Howard's placebo module, so I'll describe it because it's really elegant. The problem with EEG is that it's electricity. And so if you tap a wire in the head, if you move, if you cough, if you blink, things move in the screen. And it's really obvious to somebody who's at all skilled, even a basic technician sees when wires fall off and when stuff happens. People blink and things. So it's really hard in that way to blind. Plus, there's a real-time screen in neurofeedback, like an animation or something, yoked to changing parameters in the EEG. So if you pull a wire off, the game stops. So there's a lot of difficult ways to break that understanding, if you will, of the real-time data. But what Howard Lightstone did when building the module is he built something that when you're running a placebo subject, if you will, the computer, the software has a secret list hidden behind a panel of the people who are the study subjects, the placebo subjects. And for those people, it finds a bunch of pre-recorded EEG segments on disk, several short segments. It stitches them together, scales them all to about the same power size as the person's EEG that's live, blends the reconstructed EEG that's not the person's, and the live EEG together to display the signal on the screen. And then all of the neurofeedback parameters that are derived to drive the training games are off the stored files with no coupling to the person's brain. It's not their data, and it's not in real time, so there's no possibility of incidental learning, if you will, because there's no pattern to the rewards at that point. So it's this really sophisticated module, and that's really helped the field of neurofeedback, I think, recently start to close the gap. There's this problem in brains, but also in neurofeedback. Whenever you're working with the brain, this is true of psychology in terms of therapy, as well as things like TMS and other more invasive technologies, as well as neurofeedback, as well as meditation. The practice of these things, if you will, the clinical work, is in far advance of the research basis. I mean, things like meditation, I would say the practice of it has led the research basis by several thousands of years. In neurofeedback, the clinical work we can do tends to, be a decade or two or three ahead of what people are proving, if you will, in research papers. And there's been some reasons for that in the field, anyways. The research is just now starting to come out a little bit more robust, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies because of things like Howard Lightstone's modules in Eager that can do that. But more importantly, the limits, and it should make sense to people, the limits on good neurofeedback research have been really threefold. One is it's a therapy, not in a specific modality or intervention, and so it can't really be patented. So it's really hard to get funding for large studies. And the reason studies need to be large is because you're doing 20, 30, 40, 50 more sessions on individuals. Also a wrinkle is that the process is typically pretty heavily tailored per person and as you go. So that ends up meaning that a large N study is hard to do because you don't really want to do the same thing across people. That's not really how neurofeedback's best done. And the blinding issue that's been real hard up until very recently to placebo control EEG. So those three things together have conspired to some extent to keep neurofeedback practice way ahead of neurofeedback research backing. It's fairly straightforward in spite of that limit. In spite of the fact that the studies are all done using, less powerful protocols because they aren't tailored and small ends and look for only a few sessions. In spite of that, there's accumulating research for many things, and the research basis is best for things like seizure and ADHD, and it's becoming pretty good for things like anxiety and sleep as well. But the clinical efficacy is near slam dunk for things like migraines and PTSD and OCD and ADHD and sleep issues, anxiety, of course, all those things. It's more. I joke that we operate somewhere between a personal trainer and a mechanic in how we work. It's not so much psychology, it's not so much physiology. And that's a bit of a difference. People should understand that neurofeedbackers, to a large extent, clinicians in neurofeedback, to a large extent, are allied health professionals, usually psychologists of some stripe, therapists of some stripe, who typically learn neurofeedback skills or integrate it into their practice, but it's a therapy practice. And therefore, that's the model. You go, a few times a week. You pay $150 an hour. You're going for months, and you're doing both the process of therapy as well as the process of brain training. Typically, maybe along with it, maybe different sessions. Depends on how people do it. But I have this perspective as a neuroscientist, as somebody who's been deeply involved in clinical work, but yet has never been a therapist. I've always been that sort of like in the trenches grunt level, if you will, health and human services worker, bachelor's level at that point. I view the brain much more like the body. I'm a bit of a reductionist. I mean, yes, there are subtle energies and we're affecting everything. Ultimately, we want to affect everything, but I think we can affect almost everything by going after the brain. I think we affect our spirituality and our emotional intelligence and our nuanced generative creativity. I can train up your generative creativity. I can give you a neurofeedback protocol that will break open that wellspring. It happens to be the same neurofeedback class of protocols that works to dramatically reduce alcoholism, oddly enough. But it's this regulating deep relaxation response. It's a hypnagogic state training where you put people halfway between awake and asleep and you hold them there for 20 minutes, 25 minutes at a time. Now, you've experienced this. I'm sure you have, Ashley. You've been falling asleep and you probably spent 30 seconds in this hypnagogic window if you're lucky. And as you're falling asleep, you have an idea. Oh, that's a wonderful idea. Remember that for tomorrow. Oh, that's important. I didn't do that today. Remember that for tomorrow. And then what happens is you fall asleep, right? And it's gone. And if you're lucky the next morning, you remember there was something you should be remembering, but you don't remember what it was. Oh, I solved world hunger just before I fell asleep last night. I'm sure of it. It's that kind of like, I know there's a moment of genius. And if you put yourself in that hypnagogic liminal state, which is not really a cognitive state directly. It's more of a receptive state. You can do it reliably with neurofeedback. If you're having writer's block or you're alexithymic, you're having difficulty putting words to emotions, then this class of neurofeedback protocols can sort of, pry bar open that wellspring, literally. It kind of, becomes this sort of easily accessible place. And if you're somebody who is dramatically over aroused because you've been drinking alcohol for too many years, and in the absence of alcohol, the GABAergic effect of the alcohol is not there. The body is dependent on the GABA signal from alcohol. It's because of chronic use. It's forgotten how to make GABA. It's forgotten how to release GABA, and therefore can't make alpha waves. And that's the shaky alcoholic, the burnt out, nervous, almost like acquired ADHD syndrome that you get when you're an old burnt out alcoholic who's been drinking chronically for many years, who can't fall asleep without a drink. It's a GABA issue. You've been relying on exogenous GABA sources or GABA triggers for too long, and the brain downregulates and forgets how to make it. And so you're this shaky, nervous, can't calm down. That's why you to some extent need to give people when they're acutely dependent on alcohol things to prevent hypertensive crises, cardiovascular events, strokes, when they're detoxing from alcohol. But even, if you're a chronic user, even years later, you may not be able to fall asleep reliably, or you may be shaky or nervous or, almost like distractible as a function of being too unsoothed in your mind. And when that shows up, and we see that in brain mapping, which is one aspect of neurofeedback, when that shows up, it requires this technique, the same technique that puts you in the hypnagogic state. Because if you encourage that profound relaxation response in brains that are like this, these alcoholic overdriven brains, then after a handful of sessions, people fall asleep at will. They can calm down. Some of the first studies on this technique, this neurofeedback category, if you will, it's called alpha theta, by the way, but some of the first studies on this were done on both alcoholics and on prison populations. And in both cases, it looks like alpha theta reverses the recidivism. I think Doug Quirk did most of the prison work, and Eugene Peniston, and I forget his co-author's name, Kowalski, I think. But it's called the Peniston Protocol for Alcoholism. It's an alpha theta neurofeedback, and it's this hypnagogic state training. And in alcoholism, the recidivism rate, the relapse rate, drops from, it's inverted. It goes from 2/3 down to 1/3 when alpha theta is added in a research context. And for violent offenders, incarcerated offenders who are released, the recidivism rate drops from 3/4 down to 1/4.
Wow.
In terms of reoffending and readmittance to the prison. And this is like work in like the 60s and 70s, some of the first research on neurofeedback. Neurofeedback was sort of discovered, if you will, by 3 or 4 people at once in between the late 50s and the late 60s. It's often credited to Dr. Barry Sturman in 1967, 50 years ago. He's probably the person who definitely discovered what we mostly use in clinical neurofeedback today. He discovered SMR, which is this magical frequency to some extent in neurofeedback. It's a different class than alpha theta. But SMR training, SMR stands for sensory motor rhythm. There's a strip of tissue that runs from ear to ear, divided by a fissure, and the anterior half is the motor cortex with descending fibers, and the posterior half of that cortex is the ascending sensory system fibers where they terminate. And so you have this sensory motor cortex or sensory motor system. And when that system is calm, relaxed, physically chill, you get this rhythm that is an inhibitory tone in the brain, it looks like, called SMR, oddly enough. It's 12 to 15 hertz. And if you've seen a cat lying on a windowsill watching birds, you've seen SMR. Because it has this quality of liquid or inhibited body, motorically, not active, and mind very calm and alert. And of course, predators do this because they can leap into action from a soft body much faster than from a tight body. And so your cat watching birds wants to leap, and so it's profoundly softening its body, which actually activates its mind really nicely. In 1967, Sturman was interested in learning, and so he took cats and he trained up their SMR, which is an obvious frequency they make, using a milk dropper or a chicken broth dropper whenever they made a little bit more SMR. And he found he could train them reliably to make a little more, a little bit of reward. That's interesting. And that was one of the that was a neurofeedback discovery, if you will. And months later, he was contracted by NASA to see how dangerous methylhydrazine, rocket fuel, was for our astronauts because they were reporting getting nauseous and other things from breathing vapors. And so he was exposing cats to rocket fuel vapor and looking at what happened. And of most of the cats he looked at, they had this perfect dose-dependent curve where they hit 40 minutes, 45 minutes an hour in, and they were having seizures. But one group of cats, within about 30 cats, refused to have seizures, and they needed 2.5 times the exposure of this stuff to show these instability symptoms. Well, that was interesting. And turns out the few cats that showed different reactions were the same cats who'd used in the prior experiment to train up their SMR. SMR does something to make brains more stable. And Dr. Sturman's lab assistant was medication uncontrolled epileptic and was having seizures, lots of them. And so they trained her brain off and on, trained her SMR. And over the next couple of years, she went off all her meds and remained seizure-free.
Wow.
For like a year or more, and she was a hard case, but on meds before that. So it's this fairly, it was this fairly impactful thing. And then over the next few years, they discovered that SMR adds this sort of inhibitory tone and shuts down ADHD pretty reliably. Oh, and SMR is also what neurologists call sleep spindles. And so it seems to have some role in re-regulating the sleep onset reflex that some of us might, not have well established or well developed. So SMR became the core of the field because of Sturman's work in 1967, 50 years ago. But also there's people like Joe Kamiya up in San Francisco, who I think was doing human alpha conditioning at the same time. I think Doug Quirk may have done the work in Canada with the offenders actually in the either late 50s or early 60s. But apocryphal or not, Sturman is credited with discovering, quote unquote, neurofeedback as it's practiced today. And most of neurofeedback is either SMR or alpha theta, some variant. And then some people do other things that are less well established in the reality sphere, things that train well below 1 hertz, things that do combinations of training and stimulation, things that train one size fits all without any thought to the brain. Those have varying and maybe decreasing levels of efficacy. And then you end up, of course, in this modern day space of elaborated brain tools and toys like binaural beats and lumosities and things like that. And those have no efficacy. You heard it here, folks. There's no efficacy to go train your brain on lumosity. It doesn't do anything. Cognitive training in general, game-based cognitive training, only produces changes in the game. Largely due to practice effects, and does not tend to produce what's called skill transfer, where you show the same resource, if you will, having changed in a different context and a different environment. So cognitive training is unfortunately a non-starter for real benefit. Effortful novel idea generation might not be, and therefore crosswords or even Sudoku might be okay for your, something. But to a large extent, we're not doing much with cognitive training. But there is something there, and I just mentioned effortful engagement, if you will. That effortful anchoring or engagement of your attention is actually hugely important. And if you do that, you do get changes in your brain. And the most classic way of doing that is via something like meditation. You can also change your brain using neurofeedback, of course, and there's other ways, nootropics, there's sleep hacks, there's dietary hacks. The most powerful that you have access to is probably meditation. The most powerful that you can probably find somewhere is probably neurofeedback. And everything else in between that is more like a matter of degree, tuning or providing raw materials. But I sort of believe everyone should be doing meditation or mindfulness to some extent. I sort of wish I had found it myself in the 70s instead of maybe in the 90s or 2000s, really, because it has such a profound effect on how brains work, period. And I was one of these profoundly ADHD kids anyways. I mean, for me, it was neurofeedback when I was about 27 or 8, where I finally got rid of my acute ADHD, shall we say. with about 18 sessions of neurofeedback. It was just gone, going from the most classic case to just, oh, really? You used to have ADHD? Oh, that's interesting, kind of reactions from people. So the problem is that over time we have developed elaborating tools for trying to hack our brain physiology, and we have ever increasing tools, but not necessarily an increasing understanding of how the stuff works. I mean, it's not necessarily true that as we develop more sophisticated and sexier and tools using more computing power, that it means they work better. I would say in neurofeedback, to some extent, the best tools that are in use today and the best techniques that are in use today have probably been in use largely in their same form since the 80s. I don't think that all the most elaborate, the most new, novel, interesting, most wires kind of neurofeedback approaches are all that better. They're more complicated, they're much more expensive, but I'm not sure they're any better. That being said, it's also misleading. There's another problem in that people think that a NeuroSky or MindWave little one-channel forehead headset, they think it's actually EEG when it's a pretty noisy sensor. It's kind of lagged in time. There's some issues with how it does EEG. And there's lots of devices now in the biohacker quantified self space that are claiming to do some form of neurofeedback when they really don't do what the clinical field or the general field of neurofeedback would consider neurofeedback. So it's a pretty messy space when it comes to taking control of health. This is true in any aspect of health, I think, that's not well regulated. And this is true of every aspect of holistic health, certainly, where there's noise and there's charlatans, there's people that are operating with incredible passion, knowledge, and care, and there's people that are operating with incredible focus on their business model and not much beyond that. And I think in neurofeedback, one way that people can evaluate practitioners, I mean, because we have 50 years of history in the field, and for instance, Sturman is still actually active. He's still practicing to some extent, maybe not that actively in his clinic, but he's still doing some research. And then we have 3 or 4 generations of people who've been trained in apprenticeship models. There's about 5,000 of us in the U.S. There's probably 10,000 roughly worldwide who do this work. And a lot of them do good work. And what I would encourage people to think about in terms of a threshold for, are they on the evidence-based side, or are they maybe using things that either they don't understand or things that can't possibly work because they're more buzzword compliant than real science. For me, the threshold in neurofeedback is quantitative EEG, QEEG. And let me explain that process a little bit. It's this assessment tool where you measure resting baseline brain activity and then compare it to a normative database and see how unusual one person's brain is against other people their age. And from that, you get a sense of all the outliers, and that includes big, gross regulatory things, nothing precise, but very, very 10,000-foot view things, like how they likely process stress and attention. And I can see things like injuries sometimes, or the presence or the likelihood, if you will, of OCD or PTSD or ADHD or seizures or migraines, or occasionally other things show up in the EEG. But it's not this diagnostic tool, because while some of the patterns are meaningful across a population of people, at the individual level, these things called discriminants, these patterns in the EEG often break down and are not valid. So we end up playing this game. I joke that EEG is prognostic, not diagnostic, but really it's a hypothesis generator. We end up with 5 or 10 or 15 things that are likely to be true if you look at enough people with the patterns, and then you talk to somebody about what's going on, and you figure, this pattern often means that you've typically fallen, oh, you do have that problem, okay. And this pattern often means that you ruminate and have a touch of OCD. Oh, you do? Okay, great. And this one means okay, that's not true. Okay, let's move on. And this one means, and you figure out from the weirdness in one particular person's brain what the biggest levers for change are going to be. That's what QEEG is. And then the neurofeedback process would exercise or manipulate, if you will, all of those patterns, hopefully, as well as doing some broad exercise to move the brain in the right direction. And that's the practice of neurofeedback. But QEEG is expensive and complicated and fairly sophisticated. It takes, even today in modern tech, affordability, sort of Moore's law stuff, the system to record the data for QEEG is still at least 10 grand. And the systems to process and understand the data of QEEG, well, the software to process is usually, 10 or 20 or $30,000. And then the knowledge to use that well and to understand what you're seeing is, as the credit card commercial goes, priceless. It's hard to get a handle on what all this means without some neuroscience backing and some sense of what EEG is. One simple example, EEG is electricity. It's noisy. So if you see muscle tension or blinks and things creep into your data that aren't real, you have to be good enough at knowing what EEG is to spot noise. Just for one little tiny example. But also when you see a discriminant, okay, here's an ADHD pattern. Is that a very valid, reliable one that's most likely going to be true, or could this pattern mean 6 different things? So the process of QEEG is very sophisticated, kind of expensive, takes a couple of years to get good at. Many clinicians and neurofeedback people will actually use somebody else to process and to interpret, but they'll still have acquisition systems, and they'll do the good work. Then this degree of assessment. So what I have found is that if someone's willing to get into QEEG and learn the things the right way and the expensive way, they tend not to go after, sort of nonsense devices that don't do anything or that aren't all that proven or that are ridiculously experimental. And they tend to operate in the evidence-based side of the field. If they are somebody who's invested in QEEG, they think about the world in a more rigorous way than somebody does who thinks that, if you zap the brain with any electricity, it's going to be good, and there are people like that. So, there's this disconnect. Because this is scientific, people you can use science to cloak claims in legitimacy. And holistic medicine and health is replete with this, with us using language that is that lends credence and credibility to what we do. I mean, there's a few words specifically in holistic, and I operate in the edge of holistic medicine, if you will. Definitely not medicine, and I'm not totally holistic, but it's the same marketplace, if you will, and I operate on the edge of that. And I cringe at a couple things in holistic stuff. For me, the biggest pet peeve is the word quantum. When I hear the word quantum, I want to punch somebody. It's so far away from reality in terms of how it's used that it invalidates everything else that comes after that. And there's even a quantum neurofeedback system, which is an utter joke. But if somebody's talking about quantum, healing or something, I instantly shut down. The word detox is a close second in my mind. If you use the word detox, you're probably, there are some very narrow examples where it's actually a valid use of the word, but 9 times out of 10, people mean it's, drinking cayenne and maple syrup and starving themselves for 3 weeks and, in some ways, accelerating the body's process. Just don't put toxins in, and then your body will detox it just fine. There's nothing to be done there. Just don't, make the problem worse. Your body will be fine. You can't change the pH. You can't alkalize, alkaline water. Same thing. You can't take the pH of your blood or your internal tissues up or down. You'll die. The only thing you're affecting with alkaline water is the pH of your urine. That's it. So, it's things like that I'm like, hey, wait a minute, you've just crossed the line in terms of reality-based thinking. And in neurofeedback, there's some of that. For me, if you're on the QEEG side, then you've really invested enough time and learning and maybe money to be committed to doing it the right way and to probably, being pretty close.
Well, like you said, with you've got to always come at it from the standpoint, like with the open mind that we need to know that we don't fully understand the system.
Exactly.
And someone, goes, oh, in cancer, tumors are more acidic, right? And so they took this one piece of information and they ran with it and they said,
Right.
oh my God, we need to make the body alkaline because cancer has more acidity. And that with that logic, with that one decision, they kind of shut down the idea that, like you said, keep the beginner's mind, keep this idea that we do not have all the full understanding of the whole body, of the whole system.
Yeah.
And
It's
so
inverting
then,
cause and effect in the model. I mean, if
right.
you believe your models, if you believe your maps, if you believe the map is the territory, it will lead you astray. So if you believe that, oh my God, the model of acidity or alkalization of the body being the culprit, if you believe the model so so thoroughly, then the solution must be that. It must be bound by the model. To man with a, Maslow, to man with a hammer, every problem is a nail. If your hammer is this model on cancer, then you believe it and you must work to alkalize. But if you use a model or informed by models but don't believe them, maybe you'll try to alkalize. If it doesn't work, you'll go, okay, try something else. You won't necessarily stop there and let the cancer progress. So it's I'm not at all opposed to considering, to holding 7 impossible things in my mind before breakfast. But it's important to do so with a knowledge of where's the edges, where do things actually get fuzzy in terms of what is known, and in terms of evaluating practitioners, what I found that, and this is probably true broadly of doctors and health practitioners, the more sure somebody is, really the less you should believe them. I mean, I have a meditation teacher, and I think he got this from his teacher, but the phrase is, your mind has led you astray whenever you reach a conclusion. So as long as you aren't reaching conclusions, hard, fast conclusions, and you allow some flexibility in your model, in your concepts of how this stuff works, then you spot things, you spot movement, you spot change, and you start to see the edges of models and see how they evolve. And that, for me as a neuroscientist, that has informed my models. Operating with a bunch of in-conflict models for 15, 20 years in the EEG space has informed my model of what actually works to push brains around in neurofeedback. Some of it is heavily informed by neuroscience. Some of it is heavily informed by practical technique, clinical lore, what I've done, what I've learned, what I've observed. And some of it is purely informed by things I've tried that were suggested in data that I had no rationale for. But over time, everything that I've done has produced this sort of mental model of how the brain works that I use and I rely on, but I really don't believe. And I encourage people not to believe anything. It's really important not to take yourself or anything else too seriously. And belief is taking yourself too seriously most of the time, I think.
And with that, then we could begin to, if we keep that beginner's mind, then we can start to identify where we've come up with limiting decisions or negative beliefs that we've built about our life or about reality that we've built our own prison.
Yeah.
People build these constraints, like if they were told when they were 5 that they have ADHD, they grow up believing that that's who they are, and so they end up believing they can't do so many things because they believe the diagnosis is their prison.
Mm-hmm.
And when you can give up beliefs and you can start to have that fluidity and open your mind and go, why don't we question everything and stop just believing in things? Why don't we question everything and just as a mental practice, what if I could do what I didn't think I could do?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then we can start to play
it's
with
also
that.
voluntary. I mean, this idea of believing suggests that it's happening. It's a process. But I would argue that with this kind of belief, it's happening earlier. It's identity. It's identification. And you end up becoming the first thought or the framework on which you think, not, oh yeah, that's right, I shouldn't go become a test fighter pilot because I have ADHD. That's right. It doesn't happen there. It happens earlier. From a bias about yourself, framing, and it should to some extent, because if it's true ADHD, it's not a cognitive thing. It's not happening because you're deciding. It's happening because you're tuned that way. And the good news is you can do things. But when you identify with the diagnosis, with the label, with the bucket, whatever it is, you end up with this, as you say, this prison. This, of course, is the Buddhist idea of attachment. If you attach to things you're grasping, things you're resisting, that's still attachment. That's identification with, this thing. I am probably a Buddhist neuroscientist in that I don't really believe in identity or the continuity of consciousness, which is a pretty Buddhist idea. But I do believe in the idea that we can reduce suffering in the here and now, which is also a pretty Buddhist idea. For me, the disidentification, I think, converges with the Buddhist science and the neuroscience at the place of meditation. And so If we have a moment, I'd love to just take a moment to define what I think meditation is, and maybe a few minutes about what some practical tips people
I
can
would
use.
absolutely love to get into that. I do have a question first,
Yeah,
though. You talk about that we very early on develop that bias about ourselves. So let's say someone has developed that framework, their thinking, their belief, their self-identification, right?
yeah,
And so they come into let's say work with you,
yeah,
and they have a firm belief, it's hardwired, that
hmm
they have, for example, their diagnosis, their bucket, their ADHD.
yeah,
And then they do these sessions and they
hmm
no longer have the symptomology of ADHD. The Does their belief change, or do they still walk around with
Their
the
belief changes. Yeah, their belief changes over time. I mean, it's a multi-step process. With something like ADHD, let's say you're really ADHD, you probably procrastinate because the only moment that you have is the one right now, and you really protect it and you guard it jealously, and so therefore you procrastinate. Um, that's a habit, and if we give you all kinds of executive functions so that you can manage your moments better, uh, you may still have that habit of procrastination at some point. Sorry, for some time, until you learn different resources. But you will feel different and start identifying differently, especially when, I think finding things in your brain helps you disidentify from them. If I find, there's one example. There was a woman I worked with many years ago, maybe 5 years ago at this point, um, who was had been having some tinnitus and some tinnitus in one ear, but also had a lot of suffering, a lot of abuse from a partner, physical abuse, and she had been complaining of this left ear ringing and reduced hearing for a while, for years, and complaining of it, in context of this abuse, and didn't really get taken seriously. This auditory thing she was experiencing, and we did a QEEG, and we found this massive dysregulation in the left auditory cortex. It was really obvious, and we found some evidence of mild concussion around those sites, where she had been hit by her spouse, repeatedly on the side of the head. So there was no inner ear damage, and therefore people chalked it up to psychology. And there was no MRI damage, so people chalked it up to psychology.
Mm.
But there was tissue that was angry and stuck and, mildly inflamed at a level wouldn't really show up on a simple MRI, and, was causing trouble. I sort of pointed this out and saying, this is consistent with the things you're experiencing. I'm not sure if it's, happening, but it's very likely what's going on, especially with some other things he was experiencing that would make sense right there. And, the woman broke down crying because it was real. Because I wasn't like, you're crazy. What are you talking about?
Mm.
This weird sound you're hearing all the time, this tinnitus. It was like, oh well, this might be it, and this certainly suggests you were hitting the side of the head a lot. It was like, oh, it's real. Or ADHD. You show a teenage kid the high theta, and you go, well, this is why you have a hard time not interrupting, because the brakes are off. It's not really your mind. It's just kind of how you're tuned, kind of how the brain was, got built this time around. So, it allows people to go, would you feel guilty about your broken arm? You know, you might, if you can't, if you're that kind of person, type A person, you might feel guilty, but you shouldn't, and you shouldn't feel guilty about your ADHD or anxiety or epilepsy or depression or the fact that you get burnt out or the fact that you're drinking too much. All the management of your behavior and management of your brain is what it really comes down to, is nothing to be ashamed of and everything to be empowered by, because suddenly you discover when working on your brain that no matter how you do it, meditation, neurofeedback, nootropics, better nutrition, sleep hacking, no matter how you start to try to make change, you discover very quickly that shift happens. Things do change. And change to some extent is happening all the time, you start to realize, and you end up steering the process and optimizing the process, improving the process, and it ceases to be a burden to deal with your brain and starts to become exciting, because it doesn't keep trapping you in the same anxiety or trauma experience or sleep dysregulation or alcohol or nicotine craving or ADHD embarrassment moment or OCD behavioral disruption or whatever it is, or normal things like slowing down when you get older or needing more creativity. When you're in the context of biohacking with things like neurofeedback, meditation, nootropics, sleep hacking, you're not talking about just fixing problems. There's also a fitness aspect, and you're driving mean, a lot of my clients go from fixing their ADHD to becoming incredible high-end peak performers, and often don't stop training even though they fixed their ADHD a long time ago. And ADHD was one of those things in neurofeedback that stays fixed generally. After 30, 40 sessions, it generally is not, there's no ADHD anymore. The EEG doesn't show it. The behavior doesn't show it, on or off meds, and it rarely comes back. I mean, sometimes it does, but somewhere between 3, 4, 5 months of training, most clinicians can nail down ADHD permanently for most clients. And so those kinds of things happen, but ultimately you can make any change you want with your brain. You don't need neurofeedback equipment. You don't need crazy nootropic chemicals. You just need to maybe get a handle on your diet. That's among the most important things you can do for brain health, for moment-to-moment brain health, as well as trajectories of aging. Hugely influenced, almost entirely influenced by diet, I would argue. That's not true, but it's mostly influenced. That's the biggest thing you can do to ameliorate problems we can cause, is definitely diet. And the short answer on diet is to dramatically minimize sugar, and hopefully maximize good fats.
I love that you're answering all my questions before I have a chance to ask them, because I think maybe, you know what, I figured it out.
Uh-huh.
You've become psychic from all this neuroscience that you've been doing the last few years, right? You've
Maybe,
developed a way to pick up my thoughts, because I go.
maybe. I teach a lot too. I mean, I teach 1,000 students a year or something at UCLA. So I end up sort of getting a sense of, oh, I just said something that's gonna raise a question. Let me answer that question. you know? So I do a little bit of that, like monitoring it up and just kind of tying it back together as I go.
Well,
Because otherwise,
yeah.
I got 40 hands up in a room of 250 people asking about the thing I said 5 minutes ago that I, might have moved on from. I tend to be a ranting lecturer who has slides,
Oh, I
but
love it.
tends to walk up and down the front of the room like, going on giant tangents. I joke my superhero name is God knows what man. I can leap entire topics in a single tangent. So, but yes, diet is all, at least for aging, peak performance, brain health, is all about yes, fat, no sugar.
So is that
Um,
ketogenic? Does ketogenic
yeah, it
make a
does.
difference?
It's if your seizures, if you've got hormonal issues, keto, if you're aging rapidly, keto can be really helpful. But I don't think you need to go keto to get all the benefits that you get from keto. Really, for most people, I think you can go primal or paleo, which are sort of near keto. They
Mm-hmm.
minimize carbs. They minimize free starches and sugars. Almost all of these things eliminate grains, which I think is important most of the time for most people. These are hard to do plant-based, but you can do it, if you keep an eye on inflammatory, things in plants and keeping whole proteins put together in your diet. You can do it, but you're going to have to do a little more traditional preparation because things like legumes are hard to eat in a non-brain inflaming way unless you do a lot of traditional prep like soaking and fermenting and things. But there's ways to do this. But the easiest thing to think about is sugar. And keep your sugar if you're active, under 100 grams a day. If you're older, maybe not super active, then probably under 65 grams a day. Maybe have no more than 20 grams of carbs at any one intake, any one sitting, and never drink your carbohydrates. Never, never juice or sugar. Soda rather. I called it sugar. It's an equivalent in my mind. But yeah, juice and soda are no bueno. And unfortunately, yeah, a little coffee, a little tea, but don't put sugar in them. And then if you're under 20 grams of carbs a day, you're not going to spike your blood sugar. And so, or rarely will you, unless you already have bad blood sugar, responses. And if you keep it from spiking, keep it varying in its range, it gets more sensitive. It varies better, which is the opposite of diabetes. And the opposite of a whole host of other pro-inflammatory sort of cytokine, other signaling change that cause this environment in the body and brain that tends to lead to things like diabetes and also Alzheimer's. There's a bunch of metabolic factors that seem to drive Alzheimer's, and a big one is the stability and the insulin sensitivity, if you will, in the cells, the stability, the ranging of the insulin response. Insulin insensitivity in neurons is one of the features of what is being referred to sometimes as type 3 diabetes, which often leads into Alzheimer's. So this is critically important for aging, as well as for being healthy at 20 and up. Basically, kids may get away with more carbs, but depends on their diet, lifestyle, phenomics, genomics, all kinds of other factors. But for most adults, I wouldn't mess with going high carb for except moderation in all things, including moderation. We are a dynamic system. We can get pushed pretty hard and rebound, and there's probably nothing wrong with binging on pizza and ice cream every few weeks if you're otherwise healthy. So take everything I'm saying with a big giant grain of salt, and maybe adhere to it, well most of the time. But rigidity is its own problem. Don't be orthorexic. Don't adhere to ideas about what you should look like, what your diet should be. Adhere to the process of evaluating what's going on. Be curious instead of judgmental. Another thing you do when you're meditating, or a Buddhist perspective, when you're attaching, when you're judging your experience in meditation, a great trick is to, judgment, evaluation. Let me replace that with curiosity, which stops short of a conclusion, right? So if you're able to be curious about your process of eating, of learning to manage your sleep, your stress, whatever you're doing to intervene on your own behalf, if you're curious about it instead of judging it, you'll be flexible with it. It'll evolve with you, your life. It becomes your lifestyle, your way of eating, not your diet, your healthy habits, not your workout plan, So integrating these things as ongoing processes is really wonderful and kind of necessary. I mean, being healthy is not something you do in the gym. It's something you do in your life. And going to the gym may be part of that, or yoga, or meditation, or staying away from Krispy Kreme, or whatever it is for you.
Is there a neurofeedback? You've mentioned so many things like depression and
Yeah.
addiction. What about eating disorders, or
Yeah.
what about those? Craving is one thing, but eating
Yeah.
disorder, like the inability to control oneself,
Sure.
and then they binge.
Yeah.
Uh,
That's a complex one. And let me again say that the way I do neurofeedback, when my company Peak Brain does neurofeedback, is somewhere between a personal trainer and a mechanic. And I didn't say personal trainer and psychologist. I joke that I'm a psychologist like your bartender is a psychologist. I've seen a lot, and I have some great stories, and I actually have some good advice, and maybe listen to it, but don't rely on it and in the case of eating disorders, there's a psychological component. There's probably an anxiety-driven process. Um, it's maybe complex, and it may be a coping strategy, maybe helping you deal with something, and removing it suddenly could do weird things. But it's also probably multi-layered. It's not just psychology. I find that a lot of people that have eating disorders also tend to have some mild head injuries or concussions.
mm.
I also find that there's a lot of anxiety often driving. Of course, it's an anxiety class disorder, if you will, but I find that there's a lot of that. I also find that sometimes it's got more of an obsessive or a cognitive or almost a thought, stuck component. So I don't think about eating disorders in their pure sense. If there's deep psychology, if there's risk, if somebody's anorexic, somebody's actively bulimic and having health degrading because of that, I'd be like, hey, let's figure out who else is on your team, your psychologist, your therapist, your coach on this stuff, because, we're not everything for you. We're just going to help you with your brain. But if somebody's like, I've got 20 years of having dysregulated body image, and I'm, dysmorphic, and I manage my behavior fine, but I just, I'm totally anorexic in spite of that. I'm always sort of a dry drunk and anorexia. If somebody says that and it's being driven by that, I'd be like, great, let's look at your brain. And if I see mild head injuries and OCD patterns and impulsivity patterns, I might go, okay, well, these are three things that might be contributing to what the person's describing, to their goal, if you will, to tease apart their benefits. And then I would go after the OCD patterns and try to reduce rumination and stuck thinking. And I would go after your ADHD stuff and remove the impulsivity and try to rebuild and integrate stuff that reduce concussion markers and damage. And if along the way, the person experienced a reduction in the craving for food, then I would assume it was a win. And if the brain markers changed along the way and the person's experience continues to change, then I would assume it was a permanent change and we had made, change. And I wouldn't worry too much about if I understood what I was doing. By the same token, there are, like I said, we use a combination of the EEG and experience and occasionally clinical lore. There is a protocol in neurofeedback that you can do that seems to remove the urge to graze late at night when you're bored. Now, that's not about necessarily eating disorder. That's why I didn't start there. But there's a protocol where you train low beta across the front left and back right of the head, and you end up, people report their habitual snacks late at night get missed. They forget about them. Their cognac, their weed, their ice cream habit. They start like, oh, wait a minute, I didn't eat ice cream. That was weird. Like that the sort of habitual thing that people do when they're bored to fill the void a little bit when they're, kind of snacky, kind of late at night. It's not necessarily the same thing as an eating problem, but that same protocol seems to reduce craving for cigarettes. So if somebody's trying to quit smoking and they're doing a little bit of work around that, we may be able to reduce the craving directly, or we may be able to just add a little bit of body relaxation and get them to sort of be palliative, some palliative effect,
Oh,
or
that's
do some HRV and give them some new skills for regulating their states voluntarily, which is not neurofeedback, but it's peripheral biofeedback.
that is
So,
so fascinating. What about those, like you've mentioned, who have brain injury? So, like stroke or upper motor neuron lesions, or concussions.
yeah,
Are they able to, in a sense, rewire their brain using these
many
techniques?
are. Yeah, many are. It's really, more of a case by case basis when it comes to injury and damage. Even with acute injuries, people respond very differently, even with similar injuries. And if you said, give me 100 ADHD people, I'd give you back 90, probably maybe more, without ADHD pretty quickly. But if you gave me 100 people with concussions, I would give you back maybe 30 or 40 pretty quickly with great results. And then the rest are going to probably take 2 or 3 times as long. And some of those are going to be a little bit hard to work with and have 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But the point is you can make change, and it's still on a time course and using a perspective of change that is just alien to traditional treatment on the brain or the mind or anything else. So yes, for me, slow is helping somebody shrug off the effects of a couple severe concussions over like 6 months or 8 months. That's slow. Where it might not be slow from the point of view of a neurologist or a physical therapist or something who works with brain injuries. It might just be like, oh, okay, that's pretty fast. So we do a lot very, very rapidly, 3, 4, 5 months. And concussions, injuries, traumatic brain injuries, reducing seizures that come sometimes with TBIs, sometimes helping tissue that's been really badly injured recover. But the more severe the injury and the older you are, the more focal the deficit is. And it's less likely you can work dramatically on the deficit. And so you're working more on plasticity. I mean, one thing in brain injuries is people are usually going through several therapies, physical therapy, occupational therapy, et cetera, because there's often coordination, motor, other kind of problems. And if you're doing neurofeedback, if you're actively doing neurofeedback, there's an increase in plasticity. BDNF is upregulated, and it's measurable. In a single session, you can get an increase of the fireability of the motor cortex in one session of neurofeedback using evoked potentials, motor evoked potentials with TMS. But a single neurofeedback session makes the brain plastic, and this is very well documented now. So you do neurofeedback ongoing, and you're getting plasticity baths all the time. What I've discovered is that whatever else you're doing starts to work better. Physical therapists, I had one client come in 6 months ago, and she only did a little bit of training. She did 5 or 6 sessions, maybe 8 sessions, maybe 10 total. But she, her third session, she came in and she's like, oh, my physical therapist is very excited. She came in walking without a cane. She had a brain injury. One hand, one leg were a bit spastic, a bit numb. She couldn't quite feel them. She walked with a cane, very unsteady, very slow walking, in her 80s. And she came in the third session without a cane, just walked in. And we're like, oh, hey, look at you. And she's like, yeah, my physical therapist is super excited because all this work that she's been trying to get me to, accomplish for the past, 6 months or 8 months or a year that I've been working with her, suddenly the past few days, everything's moving, and I'm making huge gains. Or some kid who's studying language and is really struggling in language or math starts training and suddenly everything starts to work. Or somebody who's bombing their test GRE starts to train and suddenly their test scores on the GRE start skyrocketing. So or somebody who's been meditating, inefficiently or not feeling like they're getting much out of it for the past few years, suddenly starts to get like rock star level, deep meditator, yogi monk kind of stuff. I have a friend who has trained me for some acute things for a couple of years, off and on, and then he's become one of these long term, once a week guys, and he started meditating 6 months ago. And so he continues to train with neurofeedback and keep that plasticity bath going. And he started meditating daily, 20 minutes a day. And about a month ago, he started saying, okay, this is weird. This is happening. This is happening. This is happening. And what he started describing were the jhanas, were these ecstatic experiences of shaking or seeing lights. And he's having experiences that don't usually happen until you've been a pretty stead and solid meditator for like a decade. The jhanas are a typical experience that happens in concentration practices like samatha, more Mahayana stuff, not a Theravada or a Vipassana approach, but more of a concentration, single point awareness approach. When you do that for 10 years or so, you often get absorption experiences. And there's sort of these 8 jhanas that are classically known. The first 4 are pretty typical, and then the next 4 are considered higher states of consciousness. Most traditional, basic, low-key meditators would consider the jhanas a bit of a distraction, like sort of a meditative masturbation almost. But they are this absorptive experience. They're very enjoyable. They're kind of like, whoa, what was that just happened? An ecstatic experience almost. And this client of mine came in and started saying, this is happening. Is this weird? And I was like, well, what else is happening? And he started describing like the first several jhanas. I'm like, that's pretty incredible. You're meditating. Keep going. That's great. But he's basically accelerated like 20 years of meditation just by doing a chunk of neurofeedback and then adding in some meditation while continuing to neurofeedback. It accelerated everything. And I see that in lots of domains of life and work and play. So yoga practice gets better, language gets better, social function gets better, even in normal people, even in people that don't have anything wrong. So I encourage everyone to do everything they can: diet hacking, sleep hacking, neurofeedback, yoga, meditation. Whatever you got to do, stack these things. Human transformation research, literature suggests that when you add in 3, maybe 4 items, the chance of having a sort of discontinuous improvement, a transformation, goes way, way, way up, between 3 and 4 items that you add in. So, look at the things in your life. You probably aren't sleeping like you could. My biggest tip on sleep is get up at the same time every day. Make that time within 1 hour after dawn. And get a few minutes of light in your face most mornings, not through a window. Mm-hmm. And that will give you strong circadian entrainment and keep you really tightly tied to the photoperiod, the Earth's light-dark cycle, which will do all kinds of things to hormones and circadian regulation, emotional regulation, cognitive regulation, adipose and lipid regulation, cortisol, all kinds of things. We'll get a little bit of a stronger hand on the timing tiller, so to speak. So that the body and brain just kind of line up a little bit. Stress will drop, body fat will drop, energy will rise. If your circadian stuff's all dysregulated, it's among the most impactful things you could do. And then get that sugar out. Complex, good, yummy fats. If you're craving or have energy, eat fat, and never go after sugar. Minimize it to 0. And and then once you have those 2 things you nailed down, add in meditation. And then once you got that nailed down, now if you're humming along on all cylinders, throw in something like neurofeedback, which will take it up a whole nother level. It's expensive. It's a little time consuming. It takes some sophisticated technology to do, but you can do things like eliminate sleep problems or ADHD or migraines or reduce seizures or work on autism or PTSD. I should say, among things like PTSD and traumatic brain injuries, there's a network of neurofeedback providers. There's a large network, but there's one particular organization called the Homecoming for Veterans Program, which is a network mostly in the U.S. of neurofeedbackers who pledge to have a free chair available for a veteran who's dealing with PTSD or blast injury symptoms, TBI symptoms. And we do that at Peak Brain. Peak Brain's is my company, is neurofeedback and mindfulness instruction. We've got 5 locations, and so we actually do 5 free chairs. We have 5 spots available for veterans. And so if you're near one of our locations, you can get free neurofeedback. But if not, you can go to the homecomingforveterans.com or org website and look up the directory of practitioners and find somebody in your area who's offering free services to veterans. and get a little support for blast injury or PTSD. Neurofeedback is profoundly effective for PTSD. It will pull the teeth of what most people are experiencing in a matter of days or weeks, and then over time eliminate it, longer term. So
That is so fascinating. It seems as though what you are doing, it would be threatening to big pharma, because in what you've described could eliminate so many drugs from someone's life, so much profit from big pharma. Have you seen any backlash or any come up against any resistance from, because this
yeah,
this is so threatening to their, profits.
I mean, not recently, certainly, and I'm at this point one of the more vocal people talking about neurofeedback, I think, and sort of popular media and modern social media and stuff. But historically, definitely, it may again be apocryphal, but there's some stories out there that Dr. Sturman submitted these preliminary results on seizure reduction to the journal Epilepsia. And like 2 days later, his grant for studying neurofeedback and EEG, in fact, on seizure, was pulled by NIH. So that probably, the paranoid idea, which may not be, false, is that big pharma called funders and said no. We make a lot of money on Tegretol and Meberol and Dilantin, and you need to shut this down.
Hmm.
And that may have happened. I don't know if that's true or not. I think it probably is. What we do know is true is that for many years, big pharma companies were paying MDs to go to CHADD meetings, CHADD, the support group for children and adults with ADHD that existed in many cities for many years, especially pre-internet. They were sending MDs. One particular would tour all the CHADD meetings, decrying and poo-pooing neurofeedback and saying it didn't work for ADHD.
Wow.
And being paid, for that purpose. We know that happened. And at this point, in 2012 or 13, the American Academy of Pediatricians boosted neurofeedback to level 1 best support for ADHD. The only other thing in that category is stimulants. Level 1 best support meaning the literature supports it sufficiently that it should be used as a first-line intervention. And they got a lot of pushback on that, and they've changed how they're reporting that information, and it's harder to find now, I think, because of pushback in the industry. So it still happens. But information will out these days, especially in this post-internet age, right? So
Hmm.
I don't think that big pharma, quote unquote, as an entity or as a bunch of smaller interests that have financial best interests, will be able to do a huge amount to limit this long term. The cost, Moore's law, while there are no good $100 headsets out there, they're all utter bunk. You can now get a decent neurofeedback system for the hardware for about $1,000 and the software for about half that, which is ridiculously cheap compared to where it was 10 years ago. And in another decade, it'll probably be $150 for a nice self-training system. But again, the heavy lifting is not the cost of the gear; it's the knowledge about what to do with the gear, and that's something that Peak Brain's really trying to solve. I mentioned a couple of times that we are, unlike most neurofeedback people, of the 5,000 or so in the U.S., of which at least maybe half those are actively practicing busy clinics. We're one of the few that's not psychologically bound or medically perspectived. We're trying to be personal trainers, not therapists. Because of that, for us, it's about getting people in, getting them trained, and regularizing the process to make it more about how do we get you to the next brain goals and not, what's happening with your mother, right? I don't want to ask you about your mother unless she's also training. Honestly, that's the only time I want to. Hey, how's your mom doing? Is she still stressed? I'll ask that if your mom's training and stress is one of the things she's working on. But otherwise, I don't care. This is not a Freudian environment in the slightest. So for us, it's about making dashboards and regularizing feedback of information. So we have clients do surveys on sleep, stress, mood, attention. We have just a distributed network of clinics. In Los Angeles, we have a couple, plus San Diego, Orange County. We have one in Costa Mesa, and St. Louis. We have a big office out in St. Louis. And so people come to the offices a few times a week, and kind of like a gym for your brain. And instead of me saying, oh, let me take your clinical history and do the psychological work and work with you for months and months about what's going on. It's more like, all right, let's map your brain. Let's figure out what's real. Let's give you some plans. Let's give you some options. What do you want to do? All right, great. Monthly membership like a gym. Let's get you some training. And then clients engage with it over time, stop and start and pause and, continue to train and do it as they want to and as they feel effects and as they get, experiences out of it. So we're really trying to just bring the tools to people and not trying to make it a therapy just to, oh, you don't want to do that process before this process because it might pick up anxiety. Why don't you do, some anxiety work before creativity work? That's the better way to do that. So we help steer and guide. People aren't, blind in the process, but we demystify it as much as possible and then try to let our clients set goals much more like it's a performance or a fitness perspective and much less like it's, what's wrong with you, psychological, medical perspective.
You had mentioned blood flow training. I know that when the body is in the stress response, that the body shunts blood away from the logic centers of the brain.
Yeah,
Do you train people to flow blood to
we do.
can you explain
Yeah.
that?
Sure, sure. So the process of infrared blood flow dynamics training in neurofeedback is called HEG, hemoencephalography. There's two kinds of HEG in neurofeedback that are largely used. One is called NIR, one is PIR, near infrared and passive infrared hemoencephalography. We mostly use passive, PIR, HEG. And HEG, the way we use it, is really useful for migraines. There's some theory, and let me explain the process that is maybe behind most migraines, and that'll give you a sense of why and how HEG works as well. So a migraine may be a spot of the cortex. So the cortex has a quality of doing different things at different times. And often part of that is recruiting neighboring sets of cells to do the same thing it's doing, one little set of cells is doing. And so activity spreads and moves around the cortex a little bit. And sometimes an area of low metabolic activity, a depression, will also spread. And so you have this spreading cortical depression that passes over blood vessels or through areas fed by blood vessels that are on the outside of the brain, to a large extent. They go into the brain. And as the demand for metabolic resources is reduced, the blood vessel constricts. And then the spreading depression leaves that area, the tissue wakes up, and the blood vessel cramps, essentially, as it tries to supply blood when it can't because it's still constricted. It can't constrict and dilate fast enough, as fast as the neurons can change. And so you end up with this mild starvation response almost in the neuron that produces weird things like neurological symptoms. And then the sense of pain in the blood vessels, the cramping, the sort of spasming, if you will, and some of the inflammatory markers around those, inflammatory cytokines and things, that's what the migraine, the pain is for people. It's the blood vessels. Brain tissue feels no pain. It has no sensory nerve endings. Your cortex cannot be felt. I could put my thumb in it. You wouldn't have no idea. I mean, you may if you hit a speech area or a visual area or something, but you wouldn't feel it. You wouldn't have any sense of someone touching your brain. But your blood vessels can be felt to some extent. And there's other things in the outside, meninges, the scalp, the skull, all those things have some feeling because of nerves and some innervation. But they're not the brain, really. And so the brain's never felt. So in a migraine, the idea is that, well, there's this dynamic issue. The blood vessels can't supply blood reliably enough. And so what we do for PIR HEG is we take and put an infrared sensor, a passive infrared sensor, infrared camera basically, and strap it to the forehead, and measure the temperature of the front half of your brain. And then we make you think happy thoughts or focus. And when you do one of those two things, it causes a big surge of blood to your frontal lobe as it demands resources. Then you do that again and again and again in reps. And after doing that for a few minutes, we usually switch to EEG training after warming the brain up. And we often choose whatever you need for EEG training. But after several sessions of that, doing HEG, usually before EEG, but definitely HEG, if you have migraines, you stop getting migraines. In fact, it works so well that if you don't respond to HEG and you're a migraineur, we usually conclude you don't have migraines. Something else is going on. You better go see a headache specialist, a neurologist, because it works so incredibly reliably for migraines that not only is it sort of our test case for migraine to this point, but it almost validates the idea of spreading cortical depression for migraine. because it works so reliably using this model. It almost invalidates the model. So yeah, we would train up blood flow, the reliability, the vascular tone, if you will, and it becomes less widely, it swings less wildly and shuts down less easily. It's taxed less easily. And that works in migraines, and it works in things like Asperger's and in other cases where you have an anxiety response of shutting down the sort of cognitive resources like you described. So yes, we can train that back up by making you work through it and exercise the vasculature, and over time the blood flow becomes a little more robust, a little more stable. Infrared pictures show changes pre-post. And more importantly, your migraine triggers stop giving you migraines most of the time.
Wow. Oh my gosh, that is so fascinating. I could have you here for hours. I know that. I would love for us to definitely wrap up. I want to talk a little bit more about your clinic, and I also want you to cover what you were going to cover, which is teaching us those first steps of how to get into that meditation. So I'd love to do that, and then I want to talk a bit about your clinics and make sure everyone knows how they can do this, because I imagine that even there must be some people don't have anything, no symptoms, but they want to like me. I'm just going, oh my gosh, I could become faster, stronger. I could be like the superwoman of my brain. I could take my brain to this gym, and
Yeah.
I'd want to see how far I could go. Like how fast can I do math, or can I, improve my speed reading, or can I, like I'm just imagining all these really fun things I'd want to see if I could do by working my brain. So I imagine there's a lot of people like I'm wondering why you're not in Silicon Valley yet, because I bet they would all be totally into this. Are you? I know you're expanding. You have a location. You're getting a location in Portland. Is that correct?
We have QEEG services available in Portland. We still haven't moved up to an office or a concierge. Typically, how we work, we have a few different ways that people can receive services from Peak Brain. You can certainly come to one of the physical locations. Again, we have flagship offices in the west side of Los Angeles in Culver City, plus one in St. Louis, and we have some smaller satellites in downtown Los Angeles, in Costa Mesa, and San Diego. We have a couple technicians living in other cities doing concierge work. And sometimes that's full concierge work, including brain mapping or QEEG services, as well as neurofeedback. Sometimes it's just brain mapping. And the reason we offer just brain mapping is we often have groups of people in certain locations self-training. So we have a home trainer or a self-trainer program. People come to one of our offices, one of the 5 offices, for 3 days. And in that time, we do brain mapping, and we teach you to set up neurofeedback sessions on your own head. We teach you to start and stop software and know what good signals look like and really learn the process of neurofeedback, and send you home with equipment. And so you leave knowing what to do, not necessarily how, but what. And then we monitor your use of the equipment for the first 3 months and update your protocols in a shared online chart that you're keeping for us, and give you a lot of feedback and adjust your protocols and keep you moving in the right direction. And for most people who have goals that are typical for neurofeedback, it's a great way to train. And you can get a lot out of training if your goals are training lots of people or training a long time, working on lots of different things, or you have a peak performance perspective where you're going to train forever. Those people are really the ones who do the home training system. And we have a lot of Silicon Valley types that come down to LA and do a few days with me and then go back up and train themselves with some support. And because of that, we have some QEEG services available in the Bay Area as well. And Portland. We're probably going to be moving services into Boston and New York City next year, early next year. And we're probably also going to be moving services into Western Europe early next year. And that we'll have about 10 centers open, I would guess, within another 6 months. But if you're not near one of those locations, you can come to a Peak for 3 days. We'd like to do those in the Culver City or the St. Louis office. Those are the biggest offices. And I'll work with you for a few days, map your brain, go over what we think is true, help you get comfortable with training, get you up and running, and send you home with equipment. So there's some people I wouldn't recommend training that way, and those are people for whom there's a lot going on psychologically. And if you destabilize things on the way to improvement, it could be very detrimental. Like you've got a lot of significant suicidal depression or bipolar disease or something like that, where fluctuating benefits would actually not be safe. But if it's anxiety or ADHD or even things like migraines or seizures, you can probably train yourself and get just about the same benefits you would, as long as we're telling you what to do and you're relatively detail oriented. You don't make mistakes. You're not intimidated by computers, et cetera, you know?
Wow. So people anywhere around the world basically could come, travel to one of your locations for 3 days and then go back home and keep working with you guys remotely. That is very, very cool. What you do is so needed.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very impressed with it. I'm very excited. I definitely want to have you back on the show. I think this is something that we need to bring more light to. We need to get this information out there to as many people as possible, because ultimately, if we want to get our own peak performance, right, in
Hmm.
terms of our
Hmm.
health, our mental health, emotional health, spiritual health, physical health, the whole thing, we can't wait for someone else to do it for us. We have to take responsibility and be
We
our own
do. We
advocate.
do. Yeah, I mean, shift happens. It's going to happen. Do you want to choose how your brain works, or do you want to let it happen because of being pushed around by stimulus and stressors, or do you want to have some control over it? If you
Mm-hmm.
know that sugar makes you age faster and feel like crap, and you figure that out, and you figure out how to eat in a way that doesn't stress you out that way, and you control it, and suddenly you're healthier, wasn't that a great thing to do? You know, if your insulin's healthy enough to handle Krispy Kreme once a month, that's great. If you eat Krispy Kreme every day, it'll never be that healthy. So you can do these things. You should take control. You should tweak, fine tune, pay attention, uh, because you do have control. And on that note, let's give you a little bit of read into meditation or
That sounds
mindfulness.
great.
So I define mindfulness. I think Jack Kornfield came up with this definition or a variant of it, which I'm probably plagiarizing, but I modify it. I believe mindfulness is paying attention on purpose to a specific thing in a specific way to the present moment with curiosity instead of judgment, or inquiry instead of judgment, maybe. And so the idea is that you anchor your attention in a specific way. I often start teaching meditation, people respond, oh, I can't meditate, I can't, oh, I'm not good at it, oh, I can't blank my mind, oh, I never have stillness internally, stuff like that. I hear that a lot, and it sort of tells me that someone's told them what meditation is. They've gotten this idea that's just not accurate. Meditation is not blanking your mind. It may be the result. You may develop some spaciousness between your thoughts or some stillness as a result of meditation. But that's not what meditation is. Meditation is effortful anchoring of the attention. And you can anchor it in classic ways. Samatha, or single point awareness, angles it to literally that, a single point. And there's a shut out anything else. And Vipassana, or present time awareness, tends to anchor it to a process, like the breath or a sound, where you're planting your experience, your perspective in the rhythm, the flow of experience, trying to remain still and not be swept along by the experience and have additional thoughts and reactions. Or in metta, which is loving kindness meditation, the perspective, the anchor is that sense of well-being, that sense of love. TM, the anchor is the mantra that your guru has provided to you. In Ashtanga Yoga, the anchor is the repetitive sequence of poses, gaze direction, and breath that you've overlearned, and so you're not using your mind to do it. Instead, it becomes an anchor. So meditation is this process of anchoring, of learning to effortlessly stabilize. Patanjali, the father of, to some extent, modern yoga, said yoga is the orderly arrangement of your limbs to aid in the orderly arrangement of your mind. The idea is that we have some control over this machine, this meat machine that we're walking around with, and it does produce change over time if you change it. And so with meditation, don't worry about the process. In fact, if you notice you've gotten distracted, it just means one thing. It means you have a mind. You're actually alive. Because if you meditate, if you decide to focus your mind, and the way that I tend to instruct meditation, and we have on our website, on the peakbraininstitute.com website, there's a free classes link. At the bottom of that, there's a link for meditation practice you can do at home, and it's the one I'm about to describe to you. I have you do a few minutes, usually 5 minutes, of a single point awareness. And for that, I have people focus on the sensation of breath crossing the upper lip as you breathe in and out. And so you sit comfortably upright in a posture you can hold without strain for about 20 minutes. You allow your eyes to close and ideally sit upright without your back being supported. So you're very balanced, your head over your shoulders over your hips. And you sit there with your eyes closed and you breathe in and out. And you notice the sensation of air tickling the upper lip. And you try to notice only that. And you pack your attention down to a narrow point. And again, you're alive. So within moments, you're thinking about something else. You're fantasizing. You're noticing you're hungry. Your knee hurts. That girl's cute. Something. Got to do this thing tomorrow, later on that day, that dream you had. At that point, the act of meditation is to go, oh, not right now. And direct your attention back to whatever focus you chose, like the single point of awareness below your nose, above your upper lip. And that may happen again and again and again. And so maybe in the first 5 minutes you spend 50 times letting go of whatever distracted you and bringing your mind back to that still point, that single point of awareness. Well, after doing that a bunch, you discover your quality of your attention starts to change. And around the time it starts to change, 5 minutes I think is good for stabilizing it. I encourage people to shift to a more classical vipassana or present time awareness. And for that, it's better to watch a process instead of a point. And so a common one is the breath. You watch the rise and fall of the breath. And of course, the most classic instruction from this guy named Sid is when you are breathing in, know you are breathing in. When you are breathing out, know you are breathing out. And that's it. So that awareness, that knowledge, that sense of breath in and out, that process, you hold your mind through the process. And I often encourage folks to do, breathe in, breathe out, count, and try to get 10. If you're having trouble meditating, try that for a 10 count. You'll get lost, on count 2 and have to start over. But try not to count other times. Don't engage your mind otherwise. And so the basics of meditation, again, I would do 5 points of single point awareness. And the way I often have people set it up is there's timers can do this, Insight timer on the App Store can do this, where you play 3 bells or chimes at the beginning, a single bell 5 minutes in, and then 3 chimes or bells at the end. As the first 3 bells start to sound, you allow your eyes to close and place your attention on the sound of the bells. You try to notice the moment at which each sound stops ringing and transitions from sound to silence. That really drags your attention down to minutiae, to single points. And then you place your attention on the upper lip and just watch the breath sensation for 5 minutes. Whenever you're distracted, bring your mind back to the anchor. Notice, let it go, bring it back to the anchor. At 5 minutes, a single bell chimes. Place your attention on the bell. Try to notice the moment the bell stops sounding. Now place your attention on the breath. Watch the rise and fall of your breath, filling and emptying your body. And try to notice only that, anchor your attention there. When you get distracted, think, wish, hope, dream, feel. Notice it, let it go back to the anchor. And do that for 10 or 15 minutes. When the 3 bells sound at the end, hold your attention, eyes closed, until the last moment of the last bell. Then allow your attention to shift back into the present time. And open your eyes. Very simple practice. Very classic practice. Nothing special about it. Meditation is like chess. You can learn it in 5 minutes. You can get good at it, quote unquote, over time. So I encourage you to spend some time, and if 20 minutes sounds like a lot, it may be. Maybe cut it in half. And you do 2.5 minutes of samatha, and you do 7.5 minutes of vipassana, single point awareness, present time awareness. But I really like that 1-2 sort of package of stabilizing the attention and then allowing the anchored awareness to rise in the vipassana segment. And it is very, very traditional. If 10 minutes seems like too much, you should do more. And I'm being semi-serious. There's an old joke that if you have half an hour to meditate, you do it in the morning. If you have an hour to meditate, you may do half an hour in the morning, half an hour in the evening. If you do not have an hour to meditate, you must meditate for 2 hours a day. Because people, 20 minutes? What are you talking about? That's crazy. I'm busy. I'm tired. I'm hungry. I gotta pee. I gotta be about my day. There's stuff to do. There's people clamoring for my attention. And what I encourage people to think about is that if you stabilize your attention and it gets stronger and more powerful, you can do more with it. Time slows down. reactivity drops away and efficiency comes up. So if you spend half an hour on the cushion in the morning, you will get that time back. If you spend an hour, you will get that time back. But all I'm asking you to do is to spend 20 minutes if you're feeling brave for, 10, 15, 20 days in a row. Try this. Let's say 2 weeks, 3 weeks in a row. Try this for 20 minutes if you're feeling brave. If you're not feeling brave, try 10. It'll still work.
Ah, so cool. Thank you so much, Dr. Andrew Hill, for coming on the show today. Please visit peakbraininstitute.com. Definitely check out the free classes. And, I encourage listeners not only to definitely check out peakbraininstitute.com for themselves, but share this episode with your friends, especially those who have these issues that we talked about, like migraines, or you're with your friends who just want to, they're the type of person that would want to take their brains to the next level. I think we should share this information with as many people as possible. Those who have ADHD, those who have sleep issues, those who have depression, anxiety. Just think of all your friends and family you could help by letting them know that this exists, that this, without side effects. Now, just to wrap things up, are there side effects? Should we be worried about side effects, or is this something that is really safe for everyone?
Well, there are side effects, but they're not the same kind of side effects you might think about when you hear side effects, and we think about it in a cognitive or mental health capacity. It's more like, if you produce the wrong effect, let's say you come in and you're trying to train for sleep onset ability, because you just have a hard time turning your mind off and falling asleep. I can pretty reliably get you sleep onset ability, but I might not start with the right place. It might be the wrong protocol for you. And if it's really the wrong protocol, maybe you'll come in the next day and say, yeah, I was not able to fall asleep. In fact, it was worse, and my mind was racing. I couldn't fall asleep, but I didn't fall asleep until 2 a.m. And what'd you do to me? And I'll say, first of all, I'm sorry that happened. But also, it's like, oh, interesting, your brain worked that way? Well, great. First of all, if I don't repeat the exact same protocol, your brain swings back to where it was the next day or so. So it's transient, as long as you don't ignore it and keep reinforcing it. And two, how your brain responds to specific protocols is really useful to know. Oh, yeah, that response, let's drop by half a hertz, or move the electrodes, or do something different. Try a different part of your brain, a different protocol. So A, they're informative. B, they are transient, and we can almost always adjust around them, but only if the client is part of the process and can explain to us what's happening. Oh, your sleep onset's better tonight? Great. You felt a little wired right after the session, but then you felt incredible the rest of the day? Okay, let me back off a tiny bit. Oh, you got a little really tired in the session, but then later on the same day, you were like, not well rested, you couldn't fall asleep. Okay, let me go up in frequency. So we have to adjust the protocols. The brain maps give us a sense of where to start, the clinical lore, the sense of our clinical practice. But we really require the client. We need the client to be part of the process and to tell us what's happening and to figure out how their brain's responding. And with that, with them as with us on their team and them reporting these things and guiding the process, then side effects are transient, informative, and useful things, and pretty minimal, pretty easy to tolerate.
Very cool. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Andrew. Please check out peakbraininstitute.com. Please share this episode. Let's help as many people as we can. Andrew, I'd love to have you back on the show, especially when you're opening more of your clinics and get this information out there. And I have so many more questions. You've left me with more questions, but that's a good thing. I'm gonna keep my open mind. I'm gonna hold on to all these questions because that keeps my curiosity, and I think that's a good place to be. And thank you so much. Please come back on the show, share more. Let's dive deeper and continue to help people understand that we can overcome so many issues. We don't need to just wait and take a drug. We can train our body to receive the healing it needs. We can train our body to decrease stress, to have better sleep, to have healthier emotions. There's so many things we can do if we make a conscious effort. And I'm thrilled that the work you're doing is making such a big difference in the lives of those who are choosing to go to the Peak Brain Institute. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks so much for those kind words, and thanks for having me on the show. I really enjoyed chatting with you.
Enjoy what you heard today on your episode of the Learn True Health podcast. Did something move you, inspire you? Did you get great information that's going to change your life? Awesome. That's exactly what I'm here to do, is to help you gain your health back. please turn around and share this. If this is something that's helped you in any way, share this with those you love. Love the Learn True Health podcast and want to support us? Awesome. You can go to takeyoursupplements.com and you can support us that way. You'll get access to amazing supplements that are just really great quality for a great price. And there'll be someone on the other end of the line to help you pick out your supplements that are right for you. That's takeyoursupplements.com. Or join our membership, learntruehealth.com/join. That's another great way to support our podcast, support our movement, and you'll be supporting yourself. Gain more information, wonderful videos, wonderful trainings, and you'll also be able to share those with those you love as well. So go to learntruehealth.com/join. Want something fun for free? Go to learntruehealth.com, and right there on the front page, you'll see where you can get our free cookbook. I spent a lot of time making it, and it was so much fun. It's really delicious, healthy recipes. And you can also get our 7-day doctor course. Right there, it's 7 days of naturopathic videos sent right to your inbox, and you can learn from top naturopaths on how to gain health naturally. So that's takeyoursupplements.com for wonderful supplements. learntruehealth.com/join to join our awesome membership, which is only open for a limited time. You can get our free healthy cookbook, and you can also get for free 7 days of wonderful naturopathic videos sent to you. Just go to learntruehealth.com and you'll see it right there on the front page. Thank you so much for being a listener, and thank you for sharing and helping others. Let's spread this information and turn this ripple into a tidal wave.